The best African sports podcasts to listen to right now. As a sports enthusiast, there is nothing quite like immersing yourself in the world of sports through podcasts. With a wide range of African sports podcasts available, it can be challenging to choose which ones to listen to. In this article, we have compiled a list of the best African sports podcasts that you should be listening to right now. The Supersport Podcast. The Supersport Podcast is an excellent podcast for sports fans in Africa. The podcast covers a range of sports, including football, rugby, cricket, and athletics. The podcast is hosted by a team of experienced sports journalists who offer their opinions and analysis on the latest sporting events. The podcast also features interviews with some of Africa's top sports personalities, including coaches and players. The Supersport Podcast is a must-listen for anyone who wants to keep up with the latest news and analysis in African sports. The Soccer Africa Podcast. The Soccer Africa Podcast is a dedicated football podcast that focuses on the African football scene. The podcast is hosted by a team of experienced football journalists who provide in-depth analysis and insights into the latest football news. The podcast features interviews with some of Africa's top football players and coaches, providing listeners with a unique insight into the world of African football. If you're a football fan, then the Soccer Africa podcast is a must-listen. The Sports Lounge Podcast. The Sports Lounge Podcast is a popular sports podcast that covers a wide range of sports, including football, cricket, and rugby. The podcast is hosted by a team of sports enthusiasts who provide listeners with a unique perspective on the latest sporting events. The podcast also features interviews with some of Africa's top sports personalities, including players, coaches, and analysts. The Sports Lounge Podcast is a great choice for sports fans who want to stay up to date with the latest sports news and analysis. Goal.com Africa Podcast. Goal.com Africa is a popular football website that covers African football extensively. The Goal.com Africa podcast is a natural extension of the website, providing listeners with in-depth analysis and insights into the latest football news. The podcast features interviews with some of Africa's top football personalities, including players, coaches, and analysts. If you're a football fan, then the Goal.com Africa podcast is a must-listen. The Fanzone Podcast. The Fanzone Podcast is a unique sports podcast that focuses on the fan experience. The podcast is hosted by a team of sports enthusiasts who provide listeners with an insider's perspective on the latest sporting events. The podcast also features interviews with sports fans from around Africa, providing a unique insight into the passion and dedication of African sports fans. The Fanzone podcast is a great choice for anyone who wants to get closer to the action and experience the world of sports from a fan's perspective. The Off the Pitch Podcast. The Off the Pitch Podcast is a dedicated football podcast that focuses on the business side of football. The podcast is hosted by a team of football business experts who provide